And we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another live chat here on explore.org. A partnership we here at Katmai National Park have done with explore.org since 2012. My name is Andrew. I'm a park ranger here in Katmai.
And my name is Russ, also a park ranger here at Katmai, and we are situated about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage on the Alaskan Peninsula. And we had quite an experience just getting here this morning to do this, didn't we?
We certainly did. So if you are a regular webcam viewer, you might know that we had this live chat scheduled for a little bit earlier today. But we had one of Katmai's famous bear jams this morning. Both of us were stuck on opposite sides
of a sleeping bear.
A sleeping bear just several feet off the trail.
So we had to wait for that bear to move, and eventually bear management came and kind of encouraged this movement a little bit, and here we are, finally together.
But it was a several-hour delay, and that's sort of par for the course here in Katmai. That is one of the things that makes Katmai special. This is not a zoo.
That's right.
It's not an amusement park. These bears can go where and whenever they please, with a few exceptions. And so we experienced that firsthand this morning. If you were tuning into that earlier, or trying to tune in, thank you for your patience.
And thank you for coming back.
Yes, and we always like to mention, this is a particularly good time to be watching the bear cams. This is our centennial year. It's our 100th birthday as a national park. First founded as a national monument in 1918 by President Woodrow Wilson.
That's right.
And today, we're going to be talking about the sort of long and complicated history of humans and bears and how we've interacted with them over time.
That's right. We look forward to that today. We'll be going back in history.
And we'll be doing today's chat in an interview style. So Russ will sort of be our expert on hand, and I'll be asking him some questions. But if you do have questions, we'll be able to get to those later in the broadcast, probably the second half of this live chat. Feel free to comment them. Explore.org staff will be feeding us those questions, and we will be able to answer hopefully as many of them as possible.
That's right.
As time will allow.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking at the interaction of the history between people and bears.
That's right.
And I have a feeling you're going to tell us it's probably pretty complicated.
It's very complicated, and you could say that we have not always been the greatest stewards of bears.
Yeah.
There's no question it's a long, complicated history.
About how far back are we going to go?
Today we'll just go back to the Roman Empire days. And
way back.
We'll go back probably as far back, I researched, kept going back maybe to about the 2nd century.
Okay.
And what we saw is that the Romans saw bears as symbols of power and savagery, and to put it frankly, they tortured bears to death. They brought bears into the Colosseum. They would kill the bears in front of crowds, or they would use animals to kill prisoners. And it wasn't just bears that they exterminated. It was elephants and leopards and many other kind of animals.
And yeah, we sort of in popular culture, we have that image of these animals in the Roman Colosseums, and bears were a big component of that.
They sure were. And one thing I noticed when I was studying bears is one time the elephants sort of rebelled and charged into the crowd and smashed a bunch of people, and they ended up having to dig a big trench across to keep the elephants from the people. And one time the elephants actually were moaning so loudly, and the crowd became so sympathetic that they began to call curses down on the emperor. So things didn't always go well for them.
So things were wild in ancient Rome, it seems. So the bears that they would have sort of in the Colosseum, were these from Rome, or did they import them? Where would they
would import them. And before I go on to that, the Roman Emperor Gordian was another one of these emperors. He saw the death of close to 1,000 bears during his reign, so quite a lot. But there was a writer in the 2nd century named Oppian, and Oppian told us how they collected bears from Armenia. And they would go out into the forest with dogs, and they would arouse the bears out of their den using a cacophony of trumpet and cymbal sounds to alarm them.
To haze the bears.
They basically haze the bears.
Also, excellent use of the word cacophony.
It was indeed. He must have been a great writer. Once the bears were out, they'd run into these nets that they had already set up. And I'll quote once, he said, "It was a very dangerous moment then." And he says, quote, "For at that moment, bears greatly rage with jaws and terrible paws." Like we talked about on our last live
we
chat.
talked about paws last week.
That's
Yeah.
right. Now, only the strongest members of that hunting party would restrain the bear, tying its paws to these logs, and then they would put them in cages of pine and oak to transport them.
Okay, so things were relatively brutal.
Relatively brutal. Sometimes I see a Monty Python sketch when I think about this,
Right.
but not funny.
So, not funny, but yeah, so, we sort of were quite aggressive with these bears. We're not on friendly terms with this species by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
Surely things improved from there. Can we only go up from Roman times?
You would think so, but
Yeah.
things didn't really improve that much. If we get to 1606 and we look at William Shakespeare writing Macbeth,
Okay.
he had a line in that play where he says, the doomed character says of his enemies, "They have tied me to a stake, I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course."
And translate that Elizabethan language for us.
Basically, 400 years ago, people knew exactly what it meant.
Yeah.
What they would do is they would take a bear and tie it by the neck or by the legs, and then they would take bulldogs or mastiffs and they would sick the dogs into the bear, not always to kill it, but definitely to terrorize it. And people would place bets like we hear about modern day dog fighting, and that was a form of entertainment. And Queen Elizabeth I supposedly really enjoyed the sight of these bears being tormented. And if that's not enough reason to quit England, I don't know what was.
Start your own colony. So interesting. We have, what we think of today as a dog fight or a cockfight. They were doing that with bears.
They were.
In sort of the Elizabethan time, Middle Ages.
And actually, let me go back once more and show this. This is a relief found during the Roman days.
Okay.
And here we have one of the scenes you might see here is a bear that is chained to a bull. And they're going to let those two animals fight to death. And that's just one relief out of all these different scenes. You can see many different animals that were treated badly, not just bears, but that was a really brutal time in those days.
And reflected in art there of the time as well.
That's right.
And it is interesting, you were talking about how Queen Elizabeth would have these dogs menace or terrorize these bears in cages.
Uh-huh.
I often think it's always kind of a funny fact to me these days that more humans are now killed by household dogs than they are in bear attacks every single year.
That's right. More people are killed by domestic dogs. And we see that in the news from time to time. So bears have killed fewer.
Yes. So, but they do not have nearly the dark reputation that bears do.
That's
in
right.
popular media and popular culture.
True.
So we bounced ahead to Elizabethan times in England. Anything a little bit earlier than that too?
Well, we'll go back to the 2nd century for just a minute and look at a very major symbol of the bear, Ursa Major. And in the
constellation.
That's right. And in the 2nd century, the astronomer Ptolemy, he cataloged Ursa Major, and not only that, the Ursa Major was referenced by Homer. It was referenced in the Bible. It was a common symbol. Of course, it's we see that it's associated with Callisto, who was a nymph that was turned into a bear by Zeus's jealous wife, Hera.
So this is a Greek tale now.
That's a
mythology.
Greek tale.
Yep.
So we do have the Greeks. We also have in Native American culture, they would look at Ursa Major or the Big Dipper, the Great Bear, and they would look at the box part and say that was the bear, and then the 3 stars that are kind of the handle of the pot, we would say they looked at that as warriors and trailing the bear. And in autumn, the Big Dipper is very close to the horizon, and they said that the leaves turning red was the blood of a bear, and that's what was turning the leaves red. So that was a Native American lore associated around it. And no virtue you can't generalize all of the Native American population, but if you make one generality, it's that bravery was a virtue that was held
Yeah.
in high esteem.
And the bear was seen to signify that.
The bear did signify
Yeah.
bravery. So when a hunting party went out and they hunted for a bear, you had to get very close with a spear or a knife in order to kill the bear. So if you were able to do that, you were clearly a very brave person. And they did sometimes lose a hunter or two while hunting for bear.
Interesting. Okay, so we have bears showing up in cultures across the globe, particularly in regards to Ursa Major, which is the constellation that is actually featured on the Alaska state flag
It sure is.
as well.
Now, this color is a little bit light blue. The flag is much darker, but there was only so much the printer could do. So you would see the Big Dipper here. One other interesting fact, and many of you will know this, but if you look at the Big Dipper, the two stars at the end of the dipper, if you follow them in a line, it's not an exact line, but they'll get you pretty close to the North Star.
Yeah.
Now, if you're in Alaska, of course, and you're seeing it in April, you've got to look straight up above you in the sky to see it. But it's, you can also see Cassiopeia on the other side. The W-looking constellation will also point towards it.
Absolutely.
But there it is on the Alaskan flag.
And Ursa Major, similar to the name for the brown bears we have here, Ursus arctos, the northern bear, also the same name as a grizzly bear as well.
And that's great. I may jump ahead just
Yeah,
a minute with
sure.
that. When you mention that, it was categorized in 1815, and instead of Ursus arctos, it was initially classified as Ursus horribilis, terrible bear. And so you might actually look at it this way. It was classified not as grizzly, meaning gray or gray-haired, but there was a lot of talk about classifying it as grizzly or causing horror.
Interesting. So it's not so much the color, but it's sort of the menacing aspect.
There was a lot of thought about naming it because of that menacing aspect. It's true.
Interesting, because you often hear in popular culture now they get the name from the grizzled gray hairs on the back, sort of how rough they're looking, but that's actually a misnomer.
It was, it's, you know, there was a little bit of different people were categorizing it around the same time, but Ord definitely looked at grizzly in terms of, yes, a grizzly, a horrible bear, terrifying creature.
Yeah.
And that gave its reputation, which didn't really help the bear.
Absolutely. I also, side note, I enjoy the fact that when I hear that term, Ursus horribilis, Ursus arctos horribilis, it just reminds me of Looney Tunes. When you see Roadrunner
Sure.
and Wile E. Coyote pausing, gives them their Latin name of the species. It's very horribilis. It's very, very forward.
Definitely doesn't make them sound like
They
really
certainly
nice
don't.
creatures.
And so we talked about how they are sort of admired and held in esteem in a lot of Native American cultures. What about once sort of European folks started showing up on the continent?
Sure. Even if you go back again to the the 1600s and on 1700s, you have people who ran into grizzly bears. Unfortunately, those folks were not writing about them a lot. It wasn't until Lewis Clark came along and Lewis in his journals began to write about the grizzly that we gained a little bit more insight. And a couple things he said is that he's going to be comparing grizzly bears to black bears, and he wrote about grizzly bears that they are much more furious and formidable animal, and they frequently pursue the hunter when wounded. And he added, it's astonishing to see the wounds they will bear before they can be put to death. And he mentioned one that had 5 balls shot through its lungs and 5 other in various parts before it died.
Okay, so they're getting in some pretty rough encounters, Lewis and Clark are, with these bears, and it's probably worth noting that Lewis and Clark certainly didn't have the most advanced machinery to go up against these animals with.
They sure didn't. I mean, he definitely felt like they were pretty well intimidated by these bears, understandably. And the guns that they had, they were single shot. It took about 20 seconds to load in between. So if you didn't shoot the bear in the head or in the lung, it would pursue you. And if you...
So hopefully that rifle didn't fail.
which it sometimes did, or
Yeah.
someone may not have one on. And I was reading a book titled Grizzly from the 1920s, in which the author talks about he ended up killing this bear with a knife at close range. Most of the time, they tell us that if a bear was bent on mischief, you were done for.
Right.
Occasionally people survived, but they had to fight for their life.
So it's easy to understand then how in popular culture we could have a very adversarial relationship with this animal. People were not living at peace with the bears.
Not at all. Let's look
Yeah.
at this flag. A lot of our viewers watch from California.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at the California state flag.
So we already had Alaska, one state flag with the Ursa Major on it.
And now we have the California flag, and it has what notably a grizzly bear on it. How many grizzly bears are there in California today?
I previously worked at Sequoia National Park, and they all have the California black bear.
But zero grizzly bears.
Zero grizzlies.
There were about 10,000 at one time. But then you have the gold rush come. People are now settling California, and as they settle California, they're beginning to raise cattle.
Yeah.
And they see the bear as a threat to agriculture and just a menace to humanity.
Yeah.
And the decision was made to kill every single grizzly bear, which they accomplished. By 1924, California had no grizzly bears left at all.
And that's a really, I would say that coupled with the maybe American, the buffalo, the bison, that's a pretty powerful symbol of American expansion. We moved out to the West Coast, and it is, even though it is on their state flag, the most populous state now has no grizzlies.
Right.
Which I think that says something, and something for us to think about.
Yeah, certainly I feel like those areas are less wealthy because of that.
Yeah. So that's pretty dark. That's pretty grim. Is there any good news in all of this? So that was a while ago, the 1920s, that they were wiped out in California.
Well, around that time, even I believe it was 1902, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, he was a big hunter and became a big conservationist. Teddy Roosevelt had the opportunity to shoot a black bear that had been exhausted and actually tied for him to shoot. And very fortunately, he was a man of good character, and he decided, I can't shoot that animal.
Yes, and that's pretty famous.
It
Yeah.
is famous. Word got out, and people began to make the teddy bear.
Yes.
And that kind of helped a whole generation of Americans to begin to look at the bear in a little bit of a different light, maybe a little more positive light than it had been.
Okay, so think of it a little bit more as a cuddly, again, teddy bear, as opposed to the menacing animal in the woods
That's right.
that was going to try to kill you previously, as
True.
again, we thought in popular culture. Interesting. This will be also a good time to note, Russ, for folks who might just be tuning in, this is a live chat that we are doing here. We're discussing the history of human interactions and bears, and we will be doing a Q&A portion for the second half of this. If you have questions, feel free to comment them on explore.org, and we will get as many of those as we can. They're being fed to us from the lovely staff at explore.org.
And here you got Ranger Andrew, and I'm Ranger Russ.
And we're talking here on the Riffles platform along the Brooks River here in Katmai National Park. So you referenced Theodore Roosevelt and the teddy bears. Overall, good news from our national parks? Question mark?
In the national parks, yes. Overall, it's been good news.
Yeah.
The only time we've really had encounters in national parks where there were deadly encounters were either a mom with cubs or people getting too close to a bear that was on a food cache. So surprise encounters, generally.
And we do, in our bear safety orientations here in Katmai National Park, we tell visitors, never surprise a bear. Announce your presence when you're going down the trail, because if you announce your presence and a bear hears you and it doesn't want to hang out with you necessarily, it has time to move.
And I was reading a study that was done up to 1970 on all the different attacks in national parks, and they were few. One notable one that stood out to me was a fellow who thought, well, grizzly bears can't climb trees, so he climbed up the tree. He wanted to attract a sow with cubs, and I'm not sure exactly why he did this. He made the sound of a rabbit to attract this sow. I don't really even know how you make the sound of a rabbit necessarily. The grizzly bear climbed 10 to 15 feet up the tree, yanked him down, and thrashed him really good. He survived, but he paid a price for harassing that wildlife.
And he may have earned that interaction in some capacity.
He may have. In 1967, things really began to change.
Okay.
So if you go back to Yellowstone and Yosemite, in the 1900s, we were actually feeding bears.
That was a thing you would do, right? You would
Yeah.
go to Yellowstone and you see this footage, this old time footage of people in their cars feeding bears and bears coming up to check the cars out.
And not only that, they actually would dump garbage on a platform with benches around it, and people would watch these bears. Now, you also had campers and campgrounds, you had trash cans, and
Yeah.
the first major incident that really changed things was 1967. On the night of August 13th, two separate places in the park, two women were killed by grizzly bears in Glacier. And what they determined was that the bears were human habituated to food. There was so much trash in the campgrounds that the bears began to associate people, and when bears begin to associate people and food, sometimes they began to associate people with food.
Right. And that is why we are so intense here in Brooks Camp about keeping food contained, keeping human food away from bears, because we want to avoid that association.
We don't even carry candy in our pocket,
We do
no
not.
gum, nothing at all. Like, we come out here with no food.
And part of that is here in Brooks Camp we get very high visitation, and people just through their nature, they drop things, they leave things behind. And if you have a close encounter with a bear, I always joke with visitors, if you have a close encounter with a bear, you'll be glad you did not have a granola bar on your person at that time.
That's true.
But so for that reason, we make all of our visitors here put their food in a food cache, a separate building
That's
where bears
right.
can't access it.
Yeah, and so things began to change over history, and in the Park Service, humans learn just like bears do. We learned.
There's been a learning curve.
Yeah, we had a steep learning curve, and by 1970, after World War II, Yellowstone, for instance, quit feeding their bears in the public, but
Yeah.
they still had some dumps out in the backcountry that bears fed at.
Yeah.
By 1970, all of that was shut down, and they began to make sure bears were only eating natural food, so
Yeah.
there could no longer be that association. And you saw the number of incidents go down. There still have been some. They're wild animals in other parts of the country. Fortunately, that's not happen here in Brooks Camp.
Yeah, and that image of bears feeding at cars in Yellowstone is such a contrast from what we have now here, especially in Katmai, where we were backed up on the trail from a bear. We sort of let that bear do its thing, very hands-off, letting wild animals be wild.
That's right.
So, as you said, there's been a learning curve. We've
And I
sort
have
of
one
evolved.
question for you.
Yeah.
We had one president who worked in Yellowstone as a seasonal park ranger one summer, and this president was an armed guard on one of the food trucks, and he served in 1936. Do you know who that might be?
I do know who it is. The only president, as far as I'm aware, to be a seasonal park ranger is Gerald Ford.
That's correct.
My second
Well
thought on that
done.
is I love that he was an armed guard on a food truck
Yes.
because the situation with bears was so bad.
Yeah, he had another duty that I thought was interesting. He was one of the rangers that would wake up. He would go out from 5 to 7 a.m. and they had to catalog the make, model, and license plate of every car in the parking lot. And there were about 150 to 200 cars, and he enjoyed that duty because it kept him in shape because he was
Yeah.
a football player. And but imagine only 150 to 200 cars in Yellowstone.
Right. Different time.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Yellowstone a little bit there. Let's bring it back here to Katmai National Park here in remote Bush, Alaska.
Right.
Bears, we have the bear cam. That's what a lot of people now consider synonymous with Katmai are these brown bears. But that's not the original reason that this became a national park.
That's right. As we had the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, and one of the 5 largest in history happened here in Katmai in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, about 23 miles from us.
1912.
In 1912, the night of June 6th was the first major eruption, and it created the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Many scientists came at that time, and that's why we were set aside as a national monument at that time. And then in 1931, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson setting it aside. Herbert Hoover added some land to the park, which included Brooks Camp, for the purpose of protecting the brown bears.
So the brown bears sort of came later. They were not the original impetus for this being protected area.
That's correct.
It was just later expanded. And that's really a testament to how our ideas of what a national park is, what it should be, what it should incorporate, that has changed and evolved over time.
It has, indeed.
On that note, I've heard that there have been some recent changes proposed related to our national parks and these bears.
There have, and I'm going to see if I can do my best to outline what it is that's happening with these changes. So,
Yeah.
and I'm going to look at my list for a little bit of this to make sure I get it accurate. In 2015, the Park Service proposed new rules for the 10 national parks and preserves in Alaska.
Okay.
And what these rules dealt with is predator animals. There's a lot of people that enjoy hunting,
Yep.
and they want to hunt for moose and caribou and things of that nature. And the Park Service said, well, some of these types of hunting were not in line with our mission of conservation.
Okay.
And so we proposed some rule changes that included a ban on using bait to hunt both black and brown bears, and a ban on killing wolves and wolf pups during the denning season.
This is in 2015.
That was in 2015, and
Okay.
then Interior Secretary Ron Zinke recently asked the Park Service to review those rules. And so this would essentially repeal those revisions from 2015.
Okay.
So there were some other rules that dealt with whether you use lights and things like that, whether you could shoot a caribou when it was swimming, and a couple rules. There's a few rules that are very specific to the northern part of Alaska, and they deal more with some traditional hunting practices of the Athabascan people. So there were a few exceptions for them.
Who are hunting often more for subsistence.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there were a few changes there. But back in May, the Park Service opened up a 60-day public comment period on the rule change designed to bring, what all this is about is bringing federal rules
Yep.
in closer alignment with Alaskan rules. And so the comment period just got extended.
Okay.
It was supposed to end 2 days ago, but they've extended the comment period until September 6th. And National Park Service spokesman in Anchorage, Pete Christian, said, what we'll do is take all the comments as they come in and evaluate it, and substantive comments will be considered in the final rule.
Okay, so people can still comment on these proposed changes.
They can. And one thing I would say, when they use the word substantive comments will be considered, the way I look at it, it certainly can be good to click a button in the email you get from a conservancy organization and add your name to the list.
Right.
But in essence, they've got 10,000 comments that say the exact same thing.
Right.
So if you're really passionate about this issue, I think there's a lot more power in an email, a handwritten letter,
Yeah.
something that a phone call, something crafted specifically to your senator or your representative, stating your view, so it's a substantive comment, not just clicking on a button. Not saying that's bad, but I think you can do more if you really care.
So if people have strong feelings one way or the other about those proposed changes, they should submit those comments to their elected officials.
And I like that you said one way or the other.
Yes.
Whichever way they view, they should yes, get those out to their elected official.
Okay. And I think you said that is comment period's going until September 6th.
Till September 6th now.
So these are changes that are happening currently. So we've talked about how we've had these various interactions with bears over the human history, over the past several thousand years, but we're still sort of modifying how we approach these situations.
We are. We make modifications, here from time to time. We want to use the best practices that we can for living around these bears. Andrew, it's like we share the same genetic makeup as our ancestors. We
Yes.
carry the same DNA. I think there's something really valuable in today's world at having to move through the forest with caution, having a sense of awe and a sense of mystery and a sense of wonder that we get from being around these bears.
There's something timeless sort of about that, sort of not even just in our own lives and experiences, but intergenerationally, sort
Right.
of that reverence for nature moving through it.
Right, and I think
Yeah.
there's so much we can learn about the natural world by interacting with the bears that for that reason alone, I think it's worth protecting these animals and being good stewards of them.
Absolutely. So we are now about halfway through this
Okay.
broadcast. So I think this might be a good time to open it up for questions. Again, if you're just joining us, my name is Andrew,
My name is Russ.
and this is a live chat we are doing here on the Brooks River in Katmai National Park. And many of you, I've been looking through them as you've been talking, Russ.
Okay.
I've been submitting questions.
Oh, good.
Through explore.org. Feel free to comment more questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Here's one person, Russ, who is wondering, it appears to me that the river current seems much stronger than last year and the falls look significantly higher. I wonder if fewer salmon will be able to jump the falls and get upriver to spawn. I'm concerned about the food supply for bears being limited.
Understandable concern, and if you're observing it, we both started last year at this
Yeah.
park, and last year the river levels were exceptionally low. By having lower river, bears could feed even in the lower river area.
Yeah.
This year, I believe the salmon are able to get up the falls just as well. In some ways, maybe better because of the higher water level, the shorter jump. But generally, these fish for thousands of years have been moving up this river at high water level years and low water level years. They're going to continue to make it over the falls.
They're pretty resilient. And the other thing I would note is that the salmon numbers for this year are actually pretty stellar, pretty high. Both last year and this year, near record runs. I think last year was one of the top 4 salmon runs in Bristol Bay ever. And this year it's supposed to be similar, about 51.3 million sockeye salmon coming up. And we can see that in how hefty our bears already are.
They definitely, I mean, there's many bears here and a lot of subadult bears, and we've noticed them all getting food. So it seems like they're all going to be well fed. They certainly are packing on the pounds right now.
And yes, as you said, Russ, salmon are resilient. High water years, low water years, they've always pulled through, and this year seems to be no different.
Well, and one other addition to that, we're seeing a lot more bears at the falls. We'll see between 20 and 30 different bears kind of in this upper part of the river, where last year we saw fewer than that. Generally, they were at the lower river as well as upper. Now they're having to congregate
Up here.
So it does allow us to see a few more, and that's because it is harder to fish for salmon in the deeper, lower river.
More escape routes for those fish when
Right.
the bears are trying to pin them down. Another question, referencing the bear jam we had earlier. The question was, which bear was involved in the bear jam that kept us there for several hours? I got a very close look at that bear, and it was one of our many subadult bears here. I'm not able to identify that one specifically, but it was a relatively small subadult that bedded down 6 to 8 feet off the trail, maybe, relatively close.
And it must have been on my way in on the trail this morning. I passed a family group and then a couple subadults at the gate, and probably one of those subadults that I dipped off pretty deep into the woods to let them pass,
Yeah.
probably is one of them that just laid down afterwards.
Because,
So-
yeah, the Brooks Falls Trail, it's not an elevated walkway. It's not sort of a paved path. It's a dirt trail that winds through the forest.
That's right.
And bears use it all the time. There's scat everywhere, flattened down grass where they may have bedded down.
I spent a little bit of
Yeah.
time in the forest this morning off that trail letting bears pass me by.
As we like to say here, it's their world. We're just living in it.
That's right.
This is the bear's habitat. Another question related to that bear jam. Under when and what circumstances would rangers move bears from a bear jam?
First of all, it's really rare that we ever move a bear from
Yes.
a bear jam. Really a rare event. I've seen it happen 2 times this summer. It would happen if a bear is sleeping for so many hours. You have people trapped where, and generally we'll still let that go on for,
Yeah.
usually the bears move, but if they just don't, And you have people that are catching flights, people that can't move to get to food and whatnot, then there may be instances where they might just move the bear off the trail a little further.
And we should note that this bear jam this morning was over 2 hours.
About 2.5, yeah, before we decided, okay, let's just encourage this bear a little deeper off of the trail.
Yes, but yeah, a notable exception to that is if a bear is in Brooks Camp itself,
good point.
in the developed area. We do have bears who will wander into Brooks Camp proper, in front of the cabins, in front of the lodge, and that is a circumstance where we do haze them out, usually through clapping, loud noises, and we have trained professionals who do this. It's not,
That's right.
It's not Joe Schmoes. Our bear management rangers will haze them out, and that's really to avoid too much human habituation. We don't want them to get too accustomed to hanging out near human residences or outside of the lodge. So that is the one circumstance where we do, on a regular basis, nudge them along.
And it's really rare that we move them from the Falls Trail. It really is.
And it was, again, a long closure this morning, and we had visitors that had been stuck on this platform for several hours.
Right.
Let's see, what other questions do we have here, Russ? I think we are seeing the next generation of Brooks River bears, so to speak.
Yeah.
A lot of these bears have grew up in camp and around it. Are there any opinions about how these younger bears might be habituated? And I think this is a really interesting question because, to me, it sort of is illustrative of the fact that we, as humans, are only around for a little bit here, right? But Brooks Camp has been here since the 50s.
Right.
These bears have been here for quite a while. It's not as if all of a sudden this year humans are around. Yes, visitation is going up, but these bears have been seeing humans since they were cubs. Their parents saw humans since they were cubs. It is a relatively unique circumstance here in camp where these bears intergenerationally have been seeing bears. So I don't think this new generation of subadults is going to be more susceptible to being habituated necessarily than their parents, for example.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I look at these little cubs and realize that the 30-year-old bear has been seeing the same scene, ever since it was born.
Yeah. Another question tangentially related to the topic of habituation. This person is asking, with planes and water vehicles coming and going during the busy season here at Brooks Camp, has any scientific research been done or is being done on noise and how it might affect the bears in their feeding?
That's a great question. We do have, through the National Park Service, we do have soundscape scientists who are going into different parks. I know when I was in the Tetons a couple of years ago, they had a sound meter along the road, and they were studying how that affected animals in that part of the park. Up here, we do have soundscape studies. I don't know any, do you know of any directly related to the bears and airplanes and things of that nature?
I don't know of any scientific studies happening, but just anecdotally, you know, there are float planes coming in and out of here constantly during July, and they're not quiet.
No.
They can be quite loud, these planes, these float planes carrying in, you know, sometimes hundreds of visitors every single day. By and large, bears do not seem to pay much attention to them. They don't seem to notice. They go about their business just as usual. The one exception I would note to that is sometimes if a bear is on a beach and a plane comes right up next to them, the bear will often get spooked and run.
And which is why pilots comply with this. They generally try not to pull up to the beach if there's a bear within proximity. Yeah,
absolutely. But by and large, you know, bears seem to be pretty accustomed to that din, that humming of the airplane engines coming in and out.
And one of the things that has helped this place work the way it does is we as humans are in predictable spaces. So we are on these walkways, we're on specific trails, and generally they know where we're going to be. And as long as we keep that predictability, that really helps us with the bears because we're predictable to them, and that definitely helps.
That's an excellent segue, Russ, into this next question we have from a viewer. When hiking, what are the most practical things to carry to protect against bears?
Your voice.
Human voice.
The human voice. Generally, it's best to be in a group of 3 or 4 people and or more, but a group of people in general is the best practice. Because what happens when 3 or 4 people are walking together?
We talk.
We talk.
Yeah.
And as long as we're talking, we're not going to surprise the bear.
Exactly.
So the bears hear the human voice. What's impressed me about bears is how much they avoid conflict. So when they hear the human voice, they often, if they're walking down the trail towards you, you're talking, they'll hear us and they'll diverge off on a bear path through the woods, and they'll go around us or away from us. So the human voice is the number one thing. Number two is if you're in an area where it's common, I would carry bear spray way more than I would ever want to carry a gun.
Yes.
We mentioned if you have a gun and there's legalities, especially in a national park, you can't fire a firearm, but even bear spray is much more effective than a gun, is what the point I want to make, that it deters bears more effectively.
And something I would also argue is that sometimes with a gun, humans, we tend to get this false sense of confidence. We feel a little bit more secure and bold, perhaps more than we should. So I would say often that bear spray is sufficient in most circumstances. And as you were talking, Russ, I was also thinking about just, we're talking on the trail in groups. There's also a visual component to being more intimidating to a bear. And when you see bears coming at us on the trail, which happens quite a bit here in Katmai.
Yeah, it does.
There are some videos that went viral a couple years ago where a man was on the trail and bears, he said, were following them. They weren't really doing anything of the sort. Bears they have their own thing they want to be doing. Most of the time, they're not interested in us at all.
At all.
They have certainly not interested in us for food. They have plenty of food in the river. They just have somewhere they want to go.
And I think of a specific video, the bears are walking down the trail towards them. All the person has to do in that situation is simply step off. You do step off deeper into the woods where you can still kind of see the trail, but I'm far enough back. And I did it this morning. I watched the bears pass while I'm deep in the woods. The bears pass and I go back on the trail.
Because bears, just like us, will often take the path of least resistance. I would much rather travel on a trail than hiking over dead trees and sort of bushwhacking. It's much easier to just walk down the trail. And
absolutely.
Bears are going to do the same thing. So an excellent question. Let's see here. We could take this one in a number of different directions, Russ.
Okay, let's see.
Are brown bears more likely to attack people than other types of bears? And I always point out to visitors that a bear is not a bear is a bear. Like, bears are not just one blanket creature. Bears in different places will behave differently. A bear here in Katmai that is perhaps used to seeing other bears and other people at close proximity might be a little bit different than Yellowstone or Denali.
In Yellowstone, our rule there was 100 yards from any bear. In Denali, it's 300 yards from a bear, and it's based on food source, it's based on habituation. But I will go to a little bit of science from recent studies as I was doing research for this talk. Black bears have attacked more people than brown bears recently. The reason they believe that's happening is because people take greater chances around black bears.
They're feeling a little more comfort.
Word's gotten around that black bears aren't as harmless, make yourself look big, make noise, and people are taking greater chances and they're coming into bad encounters with black bears. I don't know enough about the polar bear. I haven't researched that as much, but I agree with you. The region of the country you're in matters. You should know what type of backcountry you're going into, and the bears individually matter as well.
They absolutely do. Particularly in interior locations like Yellowstone or like Denali, the bears might have a little bit more of an assertive presence around humans. If you think about it, if you are a bear in the interior, you're going to be smaller because you're not as well fed. You're going to be hungrier, and you have to travel more distance to find food. So I often will tell visitors, here in Katmai, these bears are a little bit more well-fed, a little bit more complacent, if we think about it that way.
Absolutely. The food source is so much greater here with the salmon. A bear in Denali may be looking for a ground squirrel or some roots, and it's working a little bit harder to get food than these bears are. These bears have such a great food source that it gives us a little bit more latitude to be a little bit closer.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question, Russ.
Uh-huh.
So evidently on the cam, there were some people fishing in the river. And this person is wondering if that's a safe thing for people to be doing.
That's a good question, and we hear this a lot, especially this season. It is okay to fish in the river.
Yeah.
People do fish in the river. It is common as long as you stay 50 yards away from the bear and you don't plant yourself in the middle of a feeding ground. And one thing that does happen, and I've noticed this a lot, perspective gets distorted by a zoom lens. So if I have a camera up on the falls and I'm zooming way down the river, I'm collapsing that space so it appears sometimes to us that the human is here and the bear is here, when in reality there's a lot more of a gap than it appears. So I want to be fair to the fishermen. It's not good to be planted in their food source and not moving. We need to always move 50 yards away from a bear that's approaching when practical. There's sometimes people might be fishing or photographing and a bear is quickly moving by and they're not going to be able to get that full 50 yards, but we do ask people to always remove themselves from a bear as possible.
Yeah. And
is that fair balance?
I think so, absolutely. And because it's important, these anglers, these fishermen in the river, they want to get good views of bears as well. It's just we have to maintain that safe distance.
That's right.
And I would also note, the topic of this chat was the history of human interactions in bears. How wonderful it is, that we have sort of moved largely, from as a popular society, from the sort of gruesome scenes you mentioned in ancient Rome, where we're having bears, fight dogs and putting them in cages, to wanting to get views of them in the river and admire them for their beauty, while wearing waders and catching salmon.
And hopefully as time goes on, we'll see more of that and less of the mass slaughter of animals, because it still does go on in some pockets, and we hope that there's more and more places where people can enjoy bears in a natural setting and still be able to have that sense of awe, that sense of wonder, that sense of mystery that you can get from being around these bears.
Absolutely. And I think we'll close it on that note. Again, this has been a live chat here on the Bear Cam, brought to you by Explore.org, a partnership we have here at Katmai National Park with Explore.org since 2012. My name is Andrew.
My name is Russ, and thanks for being with us today.
Have a great one.